Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on strict liability. Strict liability are offences that don't require proof of mens rea for the defendant to be guilty of a criminal offence. In this way, strict liability offences are an exception to the general rule that all criminal offences require actus reus and mens rea. With a strict liability offence, the act alone is punishable. This conflicts with the general rule of criminal liability that's concerned with fault. So, strict liability offences are primarily regulatory offences which are aimed at businesses in relation to health and safety. And that's why I've got these two pretty grim images on this first slide for you. We've got a little mouse who was in this tin of Italian green beans. And here, I'm not sure if you can tell, but this is a mouse that was actually baked into a loaf of bread. And you can tell it was baked in there because you can see its poor little feet have been sliced when the bread itself was sliced. And when you think about both of these situations, inevitably the manufacturers didn't want a mouse to end up in their products. But a mouse has ended up in their products, and that is potentially quite a serious danger to public health. And therefore, what we're saying with strict liability offences is that even though the defendant didn't necessarily want these things to happen, they don't have any mens rea, they might well have tried to avoid this happening by having different health and safety standards, but occasionally a little mouse is going to slip through the net. So they don't have mens rea, but what we're saying is, because it's so serious to public health that this has happened, we're going to find the defendant guilty regardless. So it's about protecting health and safety. On this slide here, I've got another example in this picture of a strict liability offence, which is very common, and I'm sure you'll be aware of this law, even though you perhaps didn't know it was strict liability. It's illegal to sell alcohol to a minor, to someone who's under the age of 18. But sometimes it'll happen, a young person gets sold this alcohol. In that situation, the shopkeeper probably didn't want to sell to an underage person, i.e. they don't have the mens rea, but they'll be guilty just through the act of doing it. And that's going to be the case even if they're shown a fake ID or something like that. They are guilty through doing the actus reus. And you can see again with this example, it's regulatory in nature, and it's about trying to promote health and safety and protection of the public. As we've already mentioned, the definition here, strict liability are offences where mens rea isn't required. And as I've alluded to, that will mean that the defendant's guilty often, despite not intending to do it, despite not realising that they're committing an offence. And that conflicts with the usual principle of criminal law that's concerned with fault. And that means that a lot of these cases seem quite harsh, and you will often feel quite sorry for the defendant. But as I've said, it's all about protecting the health and well-being of the public. Most strict liability offences are statutory in nature. That means most of them come from an Act of Parliament. And often they're not seen as real crimes. They're seen as being quite minor, quite trivial. On this slide here, I've listed some types of offences that are typically covered by strict liability. The most common are road traffic offences. So speeding is a classic example of strict liability. If you are doing 40 in a 30, you will be guilty of speeding. Your mens rea is irrelevant. You can't try and say to the police officer, oh, I thought it was a 40, oh, I didn't realise, I didn't know, I was trying to go and help my mum. They're not interested in your mens rea. You will be guilty for doing 40 in a 30, your actus reus is enough. So road traffic offences are very common. Speeding's one example. Another that I've once committed was driving on bald tyres. So I didn't realise, but the grip on my tyres had worn very thin, so the tyres were all smooth and shiny. Now that is dangerous because your car can slip on the road, and it's a strict liability offence. So even if you didn't know that about your tyres, if a police officer catches you, immediately you'll suffer a penalty for that. Health and safety, as I've already said, so foreign objects being found in food, selling unfit food would all be covered by strict liability offences. Pollution's another one. So there are controls on factories and things about how much pollution they're allowed to put out. And if they go beyond that, it's a strict liability offence. Possession, another classic. So possession of drugs, if you ever watch any of these late night police programmes where police are arresting people for drugs, immediately the defendant will say, don't know how that got there, that's not mine, that's been planted. And that's irrelevant because possession is a strict liability offence. You will be guilty if you are found with this drug on you. They don't have to prove mens rea. And hopefully you can see there's actually a very practical reason for these strict liability offences. Because if with a possession offence, you could just say, oh, I didn't know it was there, someone's planted it, it's not mine. It would be virtually impossible to convict somebody of an offence. So by making it, we just have to prove the actus reus, it's much easier to enforce because you're not accepting excuses. Weapons, possession of weapons is the same. Currency offences as well, covered by strict liability. We're going to start now by looking at a very extreme form of strict liability. It's called absolute liability or state of affairs liability. So it is a type of strict liability, but I want you to be aware it's very harsh, and luckily we don't tend to use absolute liability very often. It's illustrated by a couple of cases I'm going to tell you about. The first one's Larcenaire. And in Larcenaire, we had a French woman who was deported against her will from Ireland to England. And as soon as she arrived in England, she was charged with the offence of being an illegal alien, i.e. she wasn't allowed to be in England. Her conviction was upheld despite the fact that she hadn't voluntarily come to England. So Ireland, if you like, have dragged her to England and she's arrested in England for being there illegally. That seems really, really unfair. And you can see here our principle is that absolute liability is an extreme form of strict liability. Our defendant Larcenaire was guilty even though she didn't have any mens rea, she didn't even want to come to England, and she didn't do the actus reus voluntarily because she was dragged here by the Irish authorities. So that seems extremely harsh. But it's often referred to as state of affairs because when you think about what's happening here, she's being penalised for being an illegal alien, for a state of affairs. So are you here illegally? Yes, you are. Right, you're guilty. The court's not going to inquire as to how you got there. Another case on absolute liability, which is similar to Larcenaire, is the case of Windsor. And here our defendant was drunk and he was in hospital being a bit of a nuisance. So the police were called and they dragged him out of the hospital and placed him in the police car and then arrested him for being found drunk on the highway. His conviction was upheld because all we required for liability here was that the defendant was drunk on a public highway. There was no need for the court to look at how he came to be there. So it's similar to Larcenaire because in this case, the police have dragged him onto the highway and then arrested him for being drunk on the highway, i.e. it's a state of affairs. Him being drunk and being there is enough to be penalised. So he's guilty because it's a state of affairs crime, and it does seem extremely harsh because just like with Larcenaire, he had no mens rea and his actus reus was involuntary. And hopefully you've thought to yourself, oh, that conflicts with Hill and Baxter. So that's a criticism that we can make of this type of law. Absolute liability is an extreme form of strict liability. We're going to look at just straightforward strict liability now. And Because strict liability is harsh, because your defendant's penalised without having mens rea, the case of Gammon and Hong Kong listed situations which would be strict liability. So if the crime is regulatory, and we call that quasi-criminal, so it's sort of a minor offence, it's one of social concern, the wording of the Act suggests it's strict liability, or the offence carries a small penalty. And often some of these will overlap, you'll have several of them. So if we have a look at the Gammon rules then, by looking at some cases, we've got sweet and parsley. And our defendant was a teacher who foolishly let out her farmhouse to students. And police found cannabis there that the students were smoking. And the defendant had no idea that these students were doing that. And she was charged with being concerned with the management of premises that were being used for the purposes of smoking cannabis resin. That was the offence from an Act. But the Act didn't say whether it was strict liability or not, didn't say whether mens rea was required. Now, the court said in this case she was not guilty because the court presumed that mens rea was required. And our rule here is that if the offence is truly criminal, i.e. it's a serious crime, she could have gone to prison for it, then the court presumes mens rea is required unless, obviously, the Act is very clear that it's strict liability. We've then got Blake, and this was where the defendant was broadcasting from an unlicensed radio station, and he claims that he thought he was just making demo tapes. He didn't realise he was actually broadcasting on the radio. And he was found guilty of a strict liability offence. And the court said if it's truly criminal, so he could end up in prison, liability in strict liability can be justified in the interests of public safety. And in this case, they said his radio might have been interfering with 999 calls with the emergency services. And so even though it seemed very harsh that he could go to prison for this when he didn't have mens rea, it was justified on the grounds of public safety. We've then got Callow, which is a case from the 1900s, where our defendant was a butcher and he was found guilty of exposing unfit meat for sale. And this was even though he'd taken reasonable steps by having a vet examine the meat. Now, I know that sounds really weird, but you think back to 1900s, apparently that was standard thing to do there. To check whether the meat was safe to eat, he took it to the vet. Who knows what the vet did to it. But anyway, the vet told him it was safe to sell, and it wasn't. But even though he'd taken those reasonable steps, it was a strict liability offence. He was guilty just through selling it, because society here was being protected from unfit meat. In Harrow and Shah, our defendants again took reasonable steps. They trained their staff, they put signs up, they told them do not sell a lottery ticket to someone under 16. Despite their best efforts, Saturday staff did sell to someone under 16, and our defendants were prosecuted for a strict liability offence of selling a lottery ticket to someone underage. And again, it seems very harsh because they did everything they could to try and stop it happening, but it was strict liability, and it can be justified on the grounds that underage gambling is an issue of social concern, which, if you remember, was referred to by the Gammon test. In Alpha Cell, our defendant factory owner was convicted of causing polluted matter to enter a river, and it was clear here that he didn't know this was happening. There was a burst pipe, but it was strict liability, so he was guilty regardless of his mens rea. But he was only given a penalty of £20. So although it seems harsh that we're finding these defendants guilty, just be aware they might be getting a very low penalty. And here we were protecting society from pollution. And our last case for today is stalk weighing, and our defendant pharmacist was guilty of supplying drugs on a forged prescription, even though the forgery was very believable. And so you can be guilty of strict liability even where you've not acted dishonestly, improperly, or negligently, again showing how harsh it can be. So it might be worth just pausing the video at the end now on this summary sheet on what we've just gone